Okay, maybe. Because you don't have the drawl, the Tennessee.
Well, it depends on who I'm talking to.
Oh, nice.
I'm waiting for a call back from George Dickel Distillery. You should hear me talk on the phone with him.
You flip right into it.
We're trying to get charcoal because they give their charcoal away for free. Jack Daniels, they use their charcoal for briquettes, and they have a whole Jack Daniels briquette business. But George Dickel just has it for scrap, and it saves us a lot of paralysis time to be able to get charcoal from them in truckload.
What do you use it for?
Biochar.
Oh.
Terra preta.
Huh. What's that for? I've never even heard of that.
That's a new one.
How much time you got?
You're the guy that has the time limit.
This past winter, I wrote 2 books, and I got a third of the way through my next book, and the next book is on biochar. It's called The Tao of Biochar. New Society said they could come out with it in 2010, so that's what I'm working on.
Come out with the book?
The book, yeah.
Yeah.
So the story goes back to Orellana, Francisco de Orellana, and he was with Pizarro in the conquest of the Incas, and then he was tasked to explore the upper reaches of the rivers of Ecuador, and his boss, his comandante in the conquistadors, led an expedition looking for the city of gold, El Dorado, and gave up after they ran out of food and got really hard going, and the rivers were full of waterfalls, and they couldn't transport boats and stuff. So he sent Orellana and about 20 or 30 people downriver to explore, and took the main body of 300 Spaniards and their horses back, and back to Cusco. And Orellana, along with his childhood buddy Francisco de Caraval, I think it's Francisco, Gaspar de Caraval, who was a Dominican friar and was a journal keeper, which is how we get to know all this stuff, because his journals are kept in the archives in Madrid. And the two of them grew up together, so that they're going down river together, and they encounter all these tribes of Indians, and they eventually find the Amazon and go all the way to the ocean, and then go around to Venezuela and get home. In the process, they see giant cities of glistening white, extending for tens or hundreds of miles. You could, village to village or city to city, he says it's an arrow's distance. How do they support that huge population? There's no explanation of the Amazon, which you think of as very poor soils, and you have the tropical climate, which is mostly agroforestry, milpa, chinampa systems, and fruits and starches that are not very high in protein. And how can you support populations in the tens or hundreds of millions? Okay, so another expedition arrives from Spain about 30 years later, and starts at the ocean end and starts going up the Amazon, and is immediately killed by a bunch of Indians on an island within a few weeks, probably because they were pissed off by this other party that came down and did nasty things. So then the next expedition comes, and it comes down the river again from Ecuador side, and it finds no settlements, no big cities, nothing. And this is like 50 years to 100 years later, 75 I think, and nothing but jungle. Well, why is that? And the answer was syphilis, bubonic plague, all of the various vector-borne diseases that the Europeans had left, and their swine had left, and their chickens had left, and all that sort of thing, had completely wiped out the population of the Americas, north and south. And so, you're talking about a kill rate in the 90 to 99% range. So that wiped out whole nations and cultures. When the Chinese voyage of 1421 went through, they said they encountered 3,000 nations. But by this point in the late part of the 15th century, almost all of them are gone. So it got written off to myth. The journals of this Dominican friar written off to myth. How could you possibly support those kind of populations in the tropics? It's not possible. These guys were making up stories about the Amazons and stuff, and it's like, who believes that? Lady warriors? Who believes that? Xena, you know? So anyway, what happened was, the next thing was this group of people came from Cornell University, a guy named Hart, and also before him was a guy named Stephen Dunn, who was a Confederate soldier in 1850, who went up the Amazon River looking for plantation life with black slaves that a whole bunch of people from the South could move to. And so he wrote a book called Home for Southerners. And in it he describes the rich, deep black soils of the Amazon. What are these mysterious soils? And so that leads a southern exodus into the Amazon, and they set up several plantations there that are still around today. And following on that was this expeditions from Cornell University, where they had just begun a soil science laboratory, really one of the first in the U.S., late 1850s. And this guy named Hart, who was one of the brilliant young guys who brought expeditions of his graduate students down to the Brazil, started doing soil analysis, and he started discovering these, what they called the terra preta, the black soils, terra preta do Indio, in Portuguese, the black soils of the Indians. And carbon dating in subsequent expeditions and years, the black soils, terra preta do Indio, in Portuguese, the black soils of the Indians. And carbon dating in subsequent expeditions and years later, carbon dating has now taken the soils back 6,000 years. And the process of making them was part of the culture, and that they involved pyrolysis, kiln burning in the absence of oxygen, wood, clay, and other ingredients, chicken manures maybe, different kinds of things, fish parts, and these little fragments of charcoal, which were 90% carbon because they had been burned without oxygen. It wasn't just reduced to ash, it was actual charcoal. Have micropores. So now you start to do the micropore analysis, and you start to see these cross sections, and you see it's like a set of cupboards. All these little holes of different sizes. And what happens is the microbes come in and they begin to colonize those like a coral reef. And they draw in nutrients, and the hyphae from the fungi start coming in and making communications tracks up into the trees. And so you start to get growth coming from the cupboards. And so the cupboards store the water in the rainy season and release it in the dry season. And the cupboards store micronutrients that are being brought in by lots of little insects and worms and things. And the dead bodies of those are stored in that carbon matrix. And so then what happens is, over the course of hundreds of years, is this rich, deep, dark soil goes down 6-7 feet. And it's now being mined and bagged and sold in Walmarts in Brazil as the terra preta soils of the Amazon. Because it's so rich, it produces plant growth at 800% the normal rate. And so is it any wonder that the cities disappeared in 50 years? So now they're looking at, okay, how much carbon did they actually sequester in that process? And the actual examination of that has led them to understand that you can sequester gigatons of carbon. You can go carbon negative in agriculture by recreating this terra preta process. And so that's what's now, it was originally called Agrichar, and now it's called Biochar because Agrichar got patented by some Australian company. So now it's called Biochar by the scientific community. And the idea is to find ways to pyrolysize that are accessible to people all over the world on a backyard basis. But most of the systems that are around are actually kind of dirty. And they produce a lot of off-gassing in the process because they're like building a pile of wood, covering it with dirt, and then smoking for a week. And all of that's putting carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, which is unnecessary. If you did it in different ways with low-cost burners and double envelope kilns, and you can make them from old barrels, then you can begin to think about having clean charcoal making as a business that gets carbon credits and increases soil fertility to increase food crops and make them more drought resistant. And you can begin to sequester carbon on a gigaton basis to the point where we could go carbon negative in, say, 20 years, to where we were beginning to take out the 20th century from the atmosphere.
Oh, wow.
And take us back to 350 parts per million, take us back to 250 if we want to go that far, in a century time scale. Okay, so there are glimmers of hope if you stay optimistic. And that's one of them. That's not they're starting to get categorized that with terraforming and geoengineering, and it's like, no, that's not quite the same. It's actually rediscovering agriculture of the Americas, which was very different than the Sumerians and the Hittites, right? Sumerians and Hittites started with the fertile soil in the Tigris and Euphrates, and they built the plow, they made the plow. And once you have a plow, you need somebody to pull it and somebody to steer it. And so the somebody to pull it was usually the wife, and the somebody who steered it was usually the husband. And then they got maybe several wives, and so you started getting polygamy. You had a really big team to pull your plow. And then they got into animals, and they could pull it with oxen if they cut the balls off the cows. And then they could get into horses later and have plows. And so, well, if you examine plowing, you see that puts carbon into the atmosphere because it releases it from the soil. And so soils that have been plowed off gas. And so it's a negative, it's a greenhouse forcing technology. We've been adding on tilled soil to the planet at a steady clip for the last 10,000 years. It's the European model that came to the Americas and replaced the traditional milpas and chinampas and systems of terra preta in the Americas. Iowa, how did they get 7-foot soils? Well, they found that charcoal carbon dated it and said they were using the same process. Australia, there's actually terra preta soils in Australia that were done by natives there. How did they learn? Who knows? Okay, so we can go from carbon in the atmosphere from our farming, which is producing food for 6 billion people and counting, or we can go to carbon negative from going back to these systems that they had used to support very large populations.
Yeah. Now, okay, I don't know how.
That's a biochar producing wood stove for the greenhouse. We're going to cob that over, and it's going to make biochar about every 30 minutes. You can run a batch from bamboo. Bamboo is very fast growing. It's the second fastest growing plant on the planet. It employs 6 billion people. Sorry, I take that back. 1 billion people, 1/6 of all the people on the planet. So you have the bamboo that can go into the biochar, which then has to be charged up. If you just put biochar in the soil, it's going to rob the soil of nitrogen while it fills the cabinets. But if you soak it in urine or mix it with compost and let it steep for a while, add in compost tea, you get it to a charged state, and then you put it in the garden with your compost, and you begin to immediately get an increased plant yield and all the benefits of drought resistance and so forth. So that's what we're doing. We're doing a biochar process here, and that's what my book's about also.
Thank you for that information.
Wow.
That's so brilliant. That
That
gives me
I've
hope.
never heard of.
Yeah. Can we spread that around on our videos? Or
Well,
do you
you're
want-
welcome to, but the thing about it is also that there's starting to be a major
Hold on.
backlash.
Got a bug.
Thank you.
Yeah.
There's starting to be a big backlash now, what I call the war on terra,
Wow.
which is the people who are saying this is geoengineering, and we know that all geoengineering is bad, and that it's like comparable to putting a mirror in space between us and the sun. It's comparable to spreading iron on the surface of the oceans to create more algae. It's comparable to putting sulfur dust all over the atmosphere in order to reduce the solar gain on the surface. Drastic measures, right? All of which are going to have untold effects because we are tampering with Mother Nature.
Right.
But this one actually has the benefit of having been proven over 6,000 years. And it's actually a traditional process that was a livelihood for many people over many centuries. Well, this is not the same. I mean, it can be done exploitatively, where you're clearing rainforests to make biochar, or you're taking land away from indigenous populations to make biochar. All of those are entirely possible.
Right.
You know, capitalism will do what it can. But I think actually it's misplaced to be totally in opposition to biochar just because it has potential for abuse. Because it has also this potential to take us in the opposite direction and save our ass. It's one of the few things that could. So, I mean, the other thing that could do it would be reforesting the entire Mississippi basin. You know, you go back in and plant trees, and in fact, as the climate changes, the Amazon may dry out. We're already starting to see signs of that, and that means that the Amazon rainforest goes down as one of the major kidneys of the earth. And so, if we don't put the Mississippi back to work as an Earth's kidney, we're going to be in trouble. We need to do that in the Tigris-Euphrates. You know, it needs to be done everywhere. Trees everywhere. Plant trees.
What about China?
China, absolutely.
The Yellow River or whatever?
Well, they need to plant trees all over China and so on. And the other thing is, of course, the work that Jeff Lawton and other permaculturists are doing, demonstrating that you can green the desert. Entirely feasible to green the desert. We need to do that. We need to green deserts all everywhere. And that's the way we can save the planet.
Is Oroville a good example of that? Greening the desert?
Yeah, they've planted millions of trees. Changed the microclimate of that whole area.
Yeah.
And you know, that's a big piece of what we are training people. That's why we exist here, is to train people to do those sorts of things, to become part of that paradigm of moving us into a net carbon sequestration mode. Now, there's some interesting theories bouncing around, and I'm just going to throw one out at random here, and I don't know if it's true or not because it's still not scientific. It hasn't gone through peer review or any of that kind of stuff. But we're starting to see from various publications this indication that the Little Ice Age that happened in Europe, Louis XIV putting parquet floors in the Palace of Versailles, that was in some ways precipitated by the die-off in the Americas. So you had the Spanish conquest, all of the diseases spreading all over the continent, killing 90% or more of the population. Suddenly, this heavily agriculturalized land use pattern with buildings and cities and roads went back to jungle, back to forest, and the wildlife came back in. And so when the Europeans arrived in the 17th and 18th centuries, there was this verdant, fertile cornucopia awaiting them, which was actually cultivated ecology that was left by the Native Americans. And it had gone into an overgrowth in response to the depopulation. So we were encountering this huge, endless bounty, which created the American dream. And what actually happened there was it changed the climate and lowered the temperature of the planet suddenly over the course of less than a century. It lowered the temperature of the climate of the planet. Okay, so we've proven it can be done. We can lower the temperature of the planet by putting in wilderness again. And how do you do that? Well, you're going to have to figure out how to go underground or have living roofs. You're going to have to, you might want to do that anyway as it heats up. You're going to want to figure out how to get your food from food forests. And I just came from Belize where I taught a course in agroforestry. How you get your soil building going on constantly, taking more carbon out of the atmosphere constantly, and change that whole paradigm. And it's about what they're calling no-till organic, which is to say not no-till that's chemical, but no-till that's folding back in the tops of the plants and building up the soil layers and adding carbon every year. That's what's got to shift. It's all got to change.
Brilliant.
How do you
Thanks.
feel about the Voluntary Human Extinction Project?
Yeah, I've watched that for a number of years, and I'm kind of a fan. I think that we don't have to do much about that. It may happen on its own. But
Isn't it funny that the people in that project who are the leaders, they don't commit suicide because they claim it, we got to spread the message.
yeah, it's interesting.
Jan Lundberg writes about that.